Thank you everybody for coming. I'm Carter Friend, I'm the CEO at York County Community Action.
And I'm Jeremy Ray, Superintendent of the Schools for the Biddeford, Dayton, and Saco School Department.
So we wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. We particularly want to welcome legislators who are here. Thank you so much for coming to hear about the priorities and requests that we have coming into the upcoming legislative session. We also want to thank municipal leaders. We know that there are mayors, elected officials, and others from cities, folks from school boards, superintendents. We have folks from the administration, representatives from our federal delegation, and others. So thank you all very much for coming this evening to our second annual York County Legislative Summit. I also want to thank folks who, before we get started, who helped put the event together. So that is from the City of Sanford, Jordan Wilson, the Communications Coordinator, and Lucy Regas, the Executive Administrator, who are somewhere now vanished out there. And then from York County Community Action, Heather Harris, our Director of Communications, and Mary Queen, Executive Assistant. So thank you guys very much for all of the work putting the evening together. And I also wanted to recognize the partnership that is responsible for having the event. And so this is a very broad partnership of municipalities, nonprofit organizations, and school districts. I don't think there's anything else that I'm familiar with that is like it in the state. Such a broad group of people that have come together to host this evening, but this is not all we do together. This group of organizations work together every single day, shoulder to shoulder, side by side, coordinated efforts to help the children, families, and individuals in York County. So we are thankful for the partnership, and also as you hear about the priorities and requests that we have this evening, recognize the broad range of folks that are involved in putting the evening together. So before we dig into the evening, let's do a couple of sort of housekeeping things. One is to take a look at packets that you hopefully have picked up on the way in. So there are two packets. One is the packet for the first part of the program, which is focused on homelessness. And in that packet, you'll see a program, which includes the listing of all the partners this evening, as well as the agenda for this evening. You'll also find some data on homelessness, which we won't look at. We'll look at some of that data, but not all of it tonight, so please walk away and take a look at that data. And then also in here is the copy of the priorities and requests that we will present later this evening. We'll go over in detail, as well as on the back of that, there's contact information for the folks that are speaking tonight, as well as some other folks. So if you want to have questions afterwards or want to talk with folks, you have that information as well. Then there's a second packet you hopefully picked up, which is related to the second part of the evening, focused on school district issues, and Jeremy has that.
So good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight. You haven't picked up your packet yet because we strategically place them on your tables after you get your dinner. So you can't get your education information until you go through the buffet, which is provided by the students at Sanford Regional Technical Center, and then we have a packet for you on our educational session. I'm Jeremy Ray. I serve as the president of the York County Superintendents Association. And in York County, we support the educational, nutritional, mental health, substance abuse counseling, recreational opportunities for 28,000 students, more than any other community, more than any other county in the state of Maine except Cumberland County. We also provide stewardship of almost $1 billion in taxpayers' funds. When you guys were in school and young, school was grades 1 through 12, open 175 days a year, but now legislators have asked schools, feeding, CDS, extended learning from 18 to 22, mental health, adult education, vocational education, and the list, homelessness, and the list goes on and on and on. So we're here tonight to welcome you. Think about how partnerships allow our schools to grow and maintain. And we'll be bringing you into a session where we will overview 3 to 4 of the major topics that we see upcoming in the next election. We'll ask you to sit in groups by your communities that you represent, and if those community tables aren't full, please pull in so that we can not only have a presentation, but some conversations in the small group and steps how we can stay connected during the legislative session. Thank you for attending tonight.
So let's take a quick look at the agenda for the first part of the evening, which is focused on homelessness. So I'm going to do just a quick recap of successes from the last legislative session. This is the second annual legislative summit, and we had one last year. Many of folks who were here in the room attended, and we had a lot of successes in the legislature. So I just want to acknowledge that, and we'll do that in a minute. And then one of the themes this evening is the fact that we're doing a lot of really good work in York County to address homelessness and to develop affordable housing, but it's really important that we receive state support in order to do that. And so we're going to start this evening with a review of the statewide Homeless Council legislative priorities by Emily Flingstrom, the Executive Director at Fair Tide. Then we're going to take a look at York County priorities, homelessness priorities. And so Megan Jean Gendron, the Executive Director at York County Shelter Programs, will take a look at priorities such as shelter funding, support for street outreach, case management, and other prevention strategies, as well as support for mental health and substance use disorder treatment. We're then going to take a look at three specific populations, folks who are at risk of homelessness. Susan Giambalvo, the Executive Director of Caring Unlimited, will take a look at domestic violence and homelessness. Megan Walton, the CEO of the Southern Maine Agency on Aging, will take a look at seniors and homelessness. And then Matt Nelson, the Superintendent of Schools here in Sanford, will take a look at school districts and homelessness as really as a preview for the second part of the evening. Then we'll close this portion of the agenda with, we'll review the specific priorities and asks that this group has for the upcoming legislative session, and then there'll be an opportunity for legislators to ask questions about information they've heard about those priorities. So let's get underway, and I will introduce Emily Flingstrom from Fair Tide.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you for being here this evening. I'm glad to see such a great crowd to talk about these really important issues that are impacting our community here in York County. As Carter mentioned, my name's Emily Flingstrom. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Tide, and for those of you that are not familiar with our work, we focus on affordable housing and supportive services for people that are experiencing homelessness in the southern part of York County. In addition to our housing work, though, we are also building a resource hub of social services called Mainspring, and that's going to be an incredible resource that brings together over a dozen partners to offer a variety of different programs and services under one roof. And the intention is to remove barriers to access and really take a comprehensive look at the needs that our households and our community are facing. One of the key facets of Mainspring is that instead of focusing on one singular issue or one singular need, all of the partners are coming together to figure out how we can improve the entire social service delivery system. So, really trying to move the needle and help households navigate the pathway out of poverty. So by sharing in each other's missions, we're hoping to shorten the line at all of our agencies. And I'm sharing this not to tout the work of Fair Tide, although I am very proud of what we're doing, but instead to just point out that we really have to look at the issue of homelessness not in a silo, but instead really examine how it fits within the larger housing continuum. And so this evening, I just wanted to start by taking a minute to zoom out and to take a systems look, because we really can't talk about homelessness in a comprehensive or meaningful way unless we really look at how it fits along this entire continuum. If you look at the far end of the continuum, or the right side, as you're looking at it, is home ownership, and all the way on the other side is homelessness. And there are various points in between. In order for a housing system to be really healthy, we need lots of different options available at each point in this continuum. And the fact is that right now, we are in a situation that's the exact opposite. We have a continuum that is entirely stuck. So if you look at the home ownership side of things, we don't have the variety of housing stock or the number of home ownership houses or units available for people to purchase a home, but also for current homeowners to move around within that market based on the needs that they're experiencing in their life. So, for example, we have a lot of older adults who are living in these large single-family homes where they raise their children, who would love to downsize. They'd love to move into a smaller house or to a single-floor living situation, but those units either aren't available or they're too expensive, and so they're staying where they are. And then that impacts our rental market. So our rental market, I don't think this is going to come as any surprise to anybody, but we have a lot more demand than we have supply. And part of that is because we have people stuck in our rental market. So for example, if we pull that example a little bit further, we have young families renting who would love to buy that large home that older couple is living in, but they can't because there really isn't much available and really nothing available that is affordable to a lot of folks. So our rental market is, in a situation where rental prices are extremely high. And that trend has been going on for a while. So that impacts people along the entire economic spectrum, really, but those that are impacted the most are folks that are living on lower incomes. And those are the households that we're seeing who are spending a majority of their income on housing costs and are really in this incredibly financially precarious situation where any other expense that they have to pay puts them in a spot where they may lose their housing, where they can't pay rent. And so there's a lot more households then that are falling off that financial cliff, who are experiencing homelessness. And for those folks at the lower end of the economic ladder, we don't have enough options for subsidized housing, for supportive housing, for any of those that are in the middle that you see here. So they're showing up at the doors of our shelters. And our shelters are really feeling overwhelmed by the increase in demand and the downward pressure from what's happening at that end of the continuum. And Megan, I know we'll talk more about this, but our shelters are really across our state over capacity. Our shelters are functioning on a wait list. That does not make them an emergency resource that they need to be. And so because of that, people that are experiencing homelessness are going to our shelters and not able to access a bed, and we have then, no surprise, a growing number of unsheltered individuals that we're seeing in York County and across the state. So the point is that this all is connected, right? And if we're really going to make any movement, we need to look at investments and resources along the entire housing continuum. So we're going to be talking a lot about this side of things, about homelessness, how to get people out of homelessness and into housing. But I just wanted to start with this perspective so that, as we're thinking about where dollars are going, we need to be also thinking about investing in affordable housing while we're thinking about investing in our shelters in order for the system to really function. So as Carter mentioned, I'm here also to talk from the Statewide Homeless Council perspective. And as a statewide body, we have decided to focus efforts in 3 main categories as it relates to our advocacy for funding. The first is prevention. So it's much easier to move somebody or to keep somebody in their home than it is to find housing for somebody that is experiencing homelessness or who has lost their housing. And so it's really important that we invest in programs and services that are focused on prevention. So diversion programs, flexible pots of money to pay bills that might otherwise push somebody over that financial edge, supportive services to keep people stable in their housing after they are able to access housing. So that is one area that we're really hoping to be able to have more resources come into. The second is shelter. As I mentioned, shelter is an incredibly important resource. It's a life-saving resource for individuals in our community that find themselves homeless, but it's also the entry point for the rest of this continuum. So it's not just a bed, right? It's a point where people can get into the system to get eventually to housing. So we are in a situation right now, and again, I'm sure Megan will talk a lot more about this, where many of our shelters, if not all of our shelters, here in Maine are in danger of closing because they don't have enough funds to keep their doors open. So it's really important that we are putting resources to keep these shelters in existence, to fully fund all of our shelters, but also fund them in a way that allows them to flex as needed. So for example, this winter, we have more individuals that are going to need to be inside so they don't die out in the cold. We need shelters to be able to have the ability to flex to meet the need. So that's the second piece that the Statewide Homeless Council is focusing on. And the third is housing. And when we talk about housing, we're talking actually more about resources and services to help get people into housing. So housing navigators, which their sole focus is on moving folks from homelessness into housing and then keeping them there. Rental subsidies, so that people that are living on lower incomes can actually afford rent in the private market. Landlord engagement, so we can actually get landlords to accept those rental subsidies. Flexible funds for security deposits and first month's rent. So any of those pieces that will help transition folks into housing. Everything should lead to housing. And then it kind of circles back around to make sure we have those supports in place to prevent homelessness for those folks we do move into housing. So those are kind of our three main buckets. Cutting across all of those, though, is another focus on quality data. And the way that we are supporting that work is through helping to move forward the statewide system redesign for homelessness response. And that is being done through our hubs. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the hub work that has been rolled out in our state, but we have a wonderful hub coordinator, Abigail Woods, here in York County. We're very lucky to have her leading the charge. She's working really hard to get all stakeholders and partners to get data going to one place so that we get a better handle on the scope and scale of the issue of homelessness here in York County. And we can then determine where resources should go, how interventions are working, what's successful and what's not. So that will be an incredible resource for all of us to have in York County and then statewide. So the Statewide Homeless Council is also supporting that work. I just want to recognize that it clearly will take a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of collaboration to make this system healthy again. And that's going to include, public dollars, private dollars, foundations, donors, and all of us really coming together to move the needle. The other piece, though, to make it sound maybe a little less overwhelming, is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of really great stuff happening now. There's a lot of partners that are doing our best with the resources that we do have in order to make a difference in the lives of people experiencing homelessness. So just as a couple examples, the York County Commissioners, they contributed a significant amount of ARPA dollars to allow our agency, Fairtide, to purchase the property on which we're building Mainspring. We also have funding through the Housing Navigator Pilot Program, which was legislative action that was funded to increase the number of housing navigators across the state. York County is also building a recovery center right now that will add critical beds to our county. They've also put forward a pot of flexible funds that we can use for homelessness prevention and moving people into housing. Seeds of Hope has a warming center that's opening this winter. I'm not going to steal Megan's thunder. I'll let her talk about York County shelter programs and Susan talk about Caring Unlimited, but there's amazing work that's happening. And so I'm really excited, we're really excited to continue to engage and to figure out how we can all come together to really move the needle, to make a difference, and to improve the lives of individuals in York County. So I'm gonna leave it at that, and I'm going to pass it over to Megan Jean Gendron, who is the Executive Director of York County Shelter Programs.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for being here tonight. Emily gave you sort of a zoomed out view of this statewide system, and so I want to zoom in a little bit. I recently received some feedback from a state representative who explained that she didn't really realize the role that shelters play, the critical role that shelters play in this system around prevention, around saving lives, and where shelters fit into this entire system. So I think the single most important thing to walk away from this discussion understanding is that homelessness will never be solved with any one singular approach. The solution is not just about shelters or housing or case management or behavioral health and mental health services. The truth of the matter is about every single one of those components of service coming together to help address the root causes of homelessness for each individual are needed in order to solve homelessness. And emergency shelters are the foundation of all of that work. It is once a person is no longer living outside, freezing cold, and wondering when they'll eat again, that they can finally feel safe enough to really face what led them to this place. On the screen behind me, in 1 second, on the screen behind me, I've shared a pretty simple graphic that illustrates how an emergency shelter is the entry point into the continuum of care focused on breaking that cycle of homelessness. And I'll walk through how this works in practice here in York County and for York County shelter programs, but also around the state. There in the middle, you have emergency shelters, a step one, if you will, safety and security. From there, once safe with basic needs met, in the second step, a person has the ability to begin the work and reflect on what caused them to become homeless in the first place. Individuals work with staff, beginning to outline a plan, set goals, and discussing next steps. Next, case managers and housing navigators begin working with individuals on everything from obtaining IDs to accessing services needed to address the causes of homelessness. And this is when an individual can truly begin recovery in a number of ways. The important work of connecting individuals to the care that they need continues with case managers and navigators. This step is critical in breaking that cycle of homelessness. Without addressing the root causes, we are kidding ourselves to think that folks will not eventually end up right back at the shelter. Once IDs are obtained and documentation is in place, housing navigators begin working with individuals on what the best placement for housing is, a placement that will provide the best chance at success based on that person's unique needs. Every person is different. That could be transitional housing, it could be recovery housing, it could be permanent housing in an apartment. Every person's needs are different, and this is a really important step. The next step is achieving those housing goals based on what is best for the individual and their needs. The beauty of this process with York County shelter programs is that we have over 400 formerly homeless individuals in over 120 units of agency-owned housing all over York County. And if something happens once housed, a relapse, a behavioral health episode, a job loss, we have the ability to quickly surround that individual with the services needed to keep them in their housing. Because we own it, we won't just evict them. Once again, showing how powerful these shelter-created continuums of care are. We can be flexible in a way that other organizations and private landlords cannot. In the final component of care, we continue to provide aftercare and support to keep the individual housed. That may be a ride to the food pantry one day, connecting with new providers as needed, communications with an outside landlord as part of continued check-ins, and just general check-ins with the individual as part of our navigation services provided. I hope that this helps to illustrate that shelters are truly an entry point into our own continuum of care. Once in shelter, folks have access to services that they would not otherwise have access to. We designed it in that way because otherwise they don't get the services that they need. We provide a critical lifeline and an entry point into a continuum of care that no other providers do. And yet our emergency shelter is in trouble. We are only funded through the state at approximately 30% of what it costs for us to operate. And we are at real risk of closing our emergency shelter doors, as are shelters all across the state. Our other services will remain open, but we cannot continue to sustain operations without an increase in state funding, which has not occurred in over a decade. An increased cooperation with municipalities in providing support for shelter stays through general assistance. I would also like to talk a bit about another visible aspect of the work that we do unfunded, and that is street outreach. We have done this work for 45 years of our existence, and other great agencies in this room, all of them in fact, have done this work as well. But is yet another program unfunded for shelters and is a critical component in gaining the trust of individuals. One example of this in practice has occurred in the last 2 weeks right here in Sanford. Two of the most visible individuals who have been living outside have been working with our agency for the past year. We continued to work with them, making it clear that we would be there once they were ready. One day, they were both ready. One just celebrated 14 days, and one celebrated 17 days in recovery. These are individuals, amazing. These are individuals that after years of trauma on the streets, everyone had given up on, and they'd given up on themselves. But we knew that one day they would be ready, and we knew that we would be there when they were. Both have goals of completing programs and obtaining permanent housing, and both have even expressed an interest in one day getting into social services so that they are there for someone else's ready day. As elected officials, you all are going to have so much information thrown at you. You're expected to become subject matter experts in so many areas that are not your areas of expertise. This is the why behind nights like this. We want to tell you about the great work of so many providers around this great county, the work that we're proud of, the partnerships that we have, and we also want you to know that we are all here and really hope to be invited to the table when discussing funding for emergency shelters, outreach services, substance use disorder treatment, and behavioral health treatment. We've been forced to create our own systems of care because nothing existed for the people that we serve. The insurance reimbursements are not enough for the traditional systems to build up around the individuals that we serve, and for every other sector except seemingly homeless services. Money talks, and the services just don't exist. We need your help to continue to be the true hub and spokes of services for Maine's most vulnerable. We need to act together to solve the funding issues around emergency shelters, increasing funding and access to case management services, funding a meaningful street outreach program connected to shelters, and funding for substance use disorder and behavioral health treatment. I thank you all for your time, for your service, and for working with us all to take care of Maine's most vulnerable. Now I have the pleasure of introducing the Executive Director of Caring Unlimited, Susan Giambalvo.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan Giambalvo. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many people who've come out tonight to take part and listen and learn and hopefully ask us lots of questions when we get to that. I'm the Executive Director of Caring Unlimited, and for those of you who don't know, we are the Domestic Violence Resource Center for York County. Every year we serve about 2,000 individuals who have experienced some kind of domestic violence or abuse, and we provide a full range of direct service programs, prevention work, lots of work with youth in our schools around the county, and we also try to work with systems, with criminal justice system, with the civil court system, to try to improve their responses to survivors. I think sometimes people don't necessarily realize what an important role we have as an organization to play in meeting the challenges of our community, both as prevention and diversion from homelessness and in providing some of these other steps along that continuum that Emily showed us, an emergency shelter and housing services and transitional housing. You can see right here that domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. And we just cannot ignore the intersection between domestic violence, homelessness, and economic and financial abuse. And I think that truly the direct services that we provide, like safety planning and other flexible financial assistance, are things that prevent homelessness. They allow people to remain safe in their homes so that they don't have to go through the trauma of becoming homeless. Most often, people need help with basic needs, We see people need money to pay back utilities so that they can keep their rental or that they can get a new rental, rent arrears, first month's rent, security deposits, basic needs like transportation, food, shelter, and clothing. Economic abuse is so prevalent, and almost everyone that we serve reports that they need help with those basic things. And as an agency, we're able to meet a lot of those demands, and we do the best that we can. We helped 500 different individuals with those types of things in the last fiscal year. And as I said, we are also providing other things along that continuum. We have an 18-bed emergency shelter. We have 11 units of agency-owned and operated transitional housing that we do in partnership with Sanford Housing Authority. We're working on something with Biddeford Housing Authority, which hopefully will be soon. And we also have funds from the federal government to pay for about 2 scattered site units in the community for housing. And we have a huge focus on housing navigation case management, which last year served 183 people. So these numbers are not small. What we see, though, is that even in the face of all the good work that's being done, it's not enough. Housing and emergency shelter resources are the largest area of unmet need from amongst everyone that we serve. We keep track of all the needs that we cannot meet, and there are many, and 60% of the time it is related to housing. We see how limited our shelter capacity really is. Last year, we were able to shelter 37 households, but we had 260 requests. So please just think for a moment, what is it like for those other 200 families, those other 200 heads of household who have nowhere to go when they need it the most? We've also seen that there is an increasing length of stay. We had just done our reporting for FY24, and looking back over the previous 5 years, even through the depths of COVID, we were able to have about an average length of stay of 45 days. But in this past year, it's increased to 65 days. So that's a huge increase. And again, that's more families who are waiting. And unfortunately, I don't see that changing. I only see that getting worse. Some of you may know that at the moment, there aren't any new housing vouchers available. And so what are your options when you are working your way along that continuum? You really don't have many. So we do try to get creative, to stretch our resources as much as possible and look at who and how can we collaborate to increase the resources that are available to the York County community. And we've done that through our collaboration with Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence. We'll be getting some rapid rehousing vouchers, and that allowed us to expand our housing navigation staff from 1 to 2, which is exciting, but again, really doesn't begin to touch the amount of need that we are experiencing in our community. And so we look to you for support for all of our services. Because again, we really want to think about how at the beginning of the process we can intervene quickly, flexibly, and responsively to meet those emergent needs and divert people from homelessness in the first place. And then, when we cannot do that, let us focus on how we get them in that entry point so that they can access all these other resources. We also have not had an increase in services and support for our core services since 2018. And last year, our funding for shelter actually decreased, but the level of services that we provide did not. So every day, we're out there looking for who can support us, who will help us, because we're determined and committed to meeting this need in our community. And I just also want to put in a plea, we have been the beneficiaries of some one-time support. There's been COVID money, there's been this little pot, there's been that little pot, and all of those things are very helpful. I do not mean to diminish them in any way. But what I will tell you, it is very hard to plan your services, it is very hard to sustain your services, it is very hard to expand your services when you cannot count on funding. If you just have, oh, well, here's a little this, here's a little for that, that's not sustainable. That's not a way to make an effective plan. That's not a way to deliver efficient services. So I also hope that as you consider these things, that you think about how can this support for all of our work, all of these important efforts be sustained so that as the organizations, as the service providers who are here for you, we can continue to meet these growing and sustained demands on us. So thank you very much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Megan Walton, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Southern Maine Area Agency on Aging.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Megan Walton with Southern Maine Agency on Aging, and I just want to say thank you so much for coming out this evening, and thank you to our esteemed panelists here. And if I know one thing, it's we have very limited time, so I'm going to keep my remarks short and sweet so that we have plenty of time for the panel discussion. The first thing I just wanted to share is that Southern Maine Agency on Aging is now in your community. We are at Sanford Springvale. We're in the Anderson Learning Center. We're open 3 days a week right now, so come stop on by or give us a call if you have a need. I have a question for all of you. Anyone in the audience over the age of 60 and or caring for someone over the age of 60 or has a neighbor, loved one, someone in their family they're taking care of? Okay, keep your hand raised. How many of you are aging? It's all of us. So this is the really, really important thing to know, is that homelessness is an emerging and urgent issue for people over the age of 50. If you walk away with one statistic tonight, it is the fastest growing cohort of the homeless population nationwide. It's people over the age of 50. And as we just pointed out, that's all of us. So we have a lot of work to do, and we can only do it together with the outstanding solutions, many of which you heard of tonight. The second thing that you can do, in addition to coming to the Sanford Springvale location for our agency, and to tell somebody about the growing issue of homelessness for older adults, is think about the things that you can do for your own neighbors. Something as simple as taking out the trash for a neighbor and or helping someone shovel or making sure that they get a grocery delivery once a month is life-saving. So we all have opportunities here to play a role. And then of course we've heard a lot about funding. 85% of people over the age of 60 want to age at home in their own communities. We don't want to be at nursing homes unless we absolutely have to. So help us keep people at home by investing in programs and solutions that keep people at home. Thank you so much. Time back. Here we go. Matt is up next. Matt Nelson, Superintendent of Schools. Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Wow, thank you. I don't think I'm going to be as peppy for that. I too want to start off thanking our legislatures for attending this evening, and thank you for the work that you do in terms of helping our communities, helping our people, helping our state. I'm very proud to be here tonight representing the schools, but I'm also proud to be a stakeholder, because one of the things tonight is proving, and you heard Jeremy and Carter talk about it, is the resources that we have are limited. And it's super important to make sure what we're doing with those resources is making sure that we're having the best impact possible. and that is for us being able to work together. I know in Sanford, we work very closely with our city leaders on the municipal side, the various stakeholders there. York County superintendents also work very closely together in terms of the things. We no longer can work in our silos to be able to do that. And when you're talking about homeless, you're getting an idea here about all those relationships and all those stakeholders working together to be able to take advantage of the resources, having the experts come back to say, how can we leverage, how can we move the lever? When you're talking about homeless for schools, it starts probably with a definition of a homeless from a school's perspective. We're guided by the McKinney-Vento Act. Any student in any 12-month period who lacks access to fixed, adequate, and regular housing, or doesn't have a nighttime resident. And that could be a result of anything from eviction, economic hardship, fleeing domestic violence, loss of employment, affordable housing crisis, the things that you've heard this evening. Those are impacts that come back onto our school system in terms of the families and the students that are impacted. There are different categories of homeless. You'll have some things called doubled up, where families will be doubling up with another family. We also have motels, hotels, shelters, transitional housing. That's part of those categories. And then we also have the unsheltered. And the unsheltered are the in cars, parks, campgrounds, trailers, for example. If you look at the screen behind me, we have, for York County Schools, this was data that we took from October 1st of 2023 to October 1st, 2024. And you can see, just in York County alone, that we had 725 students who fit that definition of homeless. When you're talking about homeless, there's a burden, there's an impact on schools. Obviously, there's academic support that is needed for when a student's education is disrupted or there's gaps in that. Homeless students are automatically into Title I enrolled in there. FAFSA support, free meals. I know that's not currently a concern with the legislature with approving breakfast and lunch through our schools, which is a big help. Thank you. One of the biggest impacts and burdens on school systems is transportation. And for us, that's something where we try to keep our students in their school of origin so that they're not being disrupted, but that comes with a cost in terms of wanting to have people have to be able to be transported. York County Schools alone run a fleet of over 100 vans and minibuses just for this purpose. And we don't get reimbursement for that. There's also social emotional support services that are also necessary in these particular situations that can help our students and our families navigate this to be in a position where they're able to learn. And then there's just the basic necessities when you talk about people experiencing homelessness for school supplies and clothing. One of the things that we're also seeing that I wanted to point out this evening, and we're going to talk more about it in the educational priorities program, part of the program, but when you're looking at the major increase, this is statewide data, okay? If you looked over the last 10 years, behind me is just from 2021 to 2024, when you can see that trend, okay? Prior to that, when you look at probably the 5 to 6 years before that, it was pretty level with slight increases, but you can see the impact that's happened for that. For us, in terms of things that we could be able to also look at help, that you're going to hear this and that's going to be reinforced this evening, incorporating a weighted count on homeless students in the essentials and program services funding formula. That hasn't been adjusted when you're looking at an impact to this level. Also, I talked about transportation increasing funding for transportation services to help us be able to transport homeless students to attend their school of origin for that. And I'll wrap up. I know when you talk about homeless and you talk about schools, schools can often be that one place of stability, safety, and support in the very tumultuous lives of our students who are experiencing homeless. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everybody. So we wanted to turn now to a discussion of the priorities and requests for the upcoming session, and then questions for the panel. And so let me, as we've said throughout, addressing homelessness and affordable housing crisis is a partnership, and we have tremendous partnerships at the local level, and those partnerships also, it's important that they are supported by state-level investments and state partnerships, because this also is a state-level problem. And so we did come together last year as a summit, the first annual summit, and had many successes in the legislative session that resulted some directly from work we did and some that we supported the work of others. And so I thought it was just important to highlight some of that success. So for example, in the last session, there was investment through something called the Housing Relief Fund in things like case management, housing navigation, and street outreach, which we've heard about tonight. There was also investment in low barrier shelter funding, which is our particular shelters that require additional staffing. There was not, as Megan mentioned, investment in traditional shelters, and so that gap remains. There was investment in several different affordable housing initiatives. There was investment in new funding for affordable housing home ownership program, as well as the two largest main state housing multi-family development home programs, which are Rural Rental Program and the LIHTC program. $20 million was invested in that. There was also a housing subsidy for homeless students, $2 million invested in that. As well as a very important program, which was an eviction prevention program, a pilot program, $18 million invested in that. So very important investments last year in response to the need that was recognized by the state to help local communities like those in York County respond to the needs. We also then have, based on what you heard tonight, put together priorities for the upcoming session. And so I'm going to ask you to pull out from your packet. You should see a sheet that looks a lot like this. And so you can follow along with that. And at the top of that list, these are not really in priority order, although shelter funding is one that we have been prioritizing now for a couple of years. As Megan mentioned, it's the entry point for so many other resources, and it's also helped so many folks in crisis, and there's a significant gap between the amount of funding that it takes to run a shelter and the amount of support that the shelters receive. So that's an important priority for us in the upcoming session. Homeless prevention programs. So this, I mentioned the Housing Relief Fund. That's something that has been funded, I think, on an annual basis the past several years. We really view that as a priority, as well as a continuation of funding of the Housing Relief Fund. Again, that funds programs like housing navigation and street outreach. There are also programs for rapid rehousing and diversion, which both help prevent homelessness and also quickly rehouse individuals that have become homeless. Affordable housing, Emily spoke about the fact that there is a broad continuum of needs, and we can't ignore the fact that affordable housing is an underlying cause of a lot of the homelessness we're seeing now and the lack of affordable housing in the community. So we are recommending support for investment in the full spectrum of affordable housing, including recognizing that that need looks different in different communities, and that so we need to have flexible response in local communities. Support for mental health and substance use disorder services. Mental health and substance use disorder are an underlying cause of a lot of homelessness, and there are too few resources, and in many cases the resources that exist don't sufficiently reimburse for the services that are being provided. And so those are not viable programs. So again, we're recommending that as a priority for the coming session. Domestic violence and homelessness, Susan spoke very well about this. There very specifically is a gap in the Victim of Crime Act funding that we're prioritizing filling, as well as Susan mentioned the importance of emergency housing vouchers and shelter options, as well as trauma-informed support staff and training for staff that are needed to help folks that are in crisis. Seniors and homelessness, as Megan mentioned, important funding for things like home modification and repairs in order to keep people in their housing. The best strategy is to keep people where they are. Maine has very old housing stock, and so it's important to invest in maintaining those homes so people can remain there. And then also for folks who are not able to, for seniors who are homeless, supportive housing with on-site services for seniors experiencing homelessness, as well as programs around utility and weatherization, also designed to keep people in their homes. And then finally, in terms of school districts and homeless families, as Matt mentioned, there are several different strategies, one of which, by the way, is weighted count for homeless students in the EPS formula, which is an important strategy to recognize the increased resources that school districts need to address children and families that are homeless. Family shelters so with access to childcare. That's important so that the families can receive support and that the parents can engage in community or education while they're at the shelter, as well as Matt mentioned, transportation services for homeless students. We're at the front end of the session. We don't have LD numbers for any of these yet. We don't have sponsors for these bills yet. So we will be providing updates on all of these priorities as the session unfolds. And we'll be doing that. Everyone signed up through email. We have your email. We'll be sending information out on LDs, on sponsors. If you're interested in any of these issues, particularly as a legislator and would like to sponsor any of these bills related to any of these issues, please see me or anybody on stage here. So why don't we move to the panel discussion and questions. So if you guys want to move over here. And so we'd like to ask if there are any legislators that have, the first trick is going to find out where you're supposed to sit. If there are any legislators that have any questions either about the information you've heard tonight or about the priorities and requests that we've just listed. Representative Geer, do you mind coming up? We're trying to record this, so if you could come up to the microphone here so people can see you and hear you, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, Carter. And it's a pleasure to be here. As many of you know, I have been in the legislature for 4 years. In the most recent session, for the most recent legislature, co-chaired the Housing Committee, so I've been looking at these issues for a long time. And I'm so appreciative of all of the work that you all are doing and for holding another summit, which is really great to see all of you coming together and thinking about these issues. So you might not be surprised by a couple of the questions I'm going to ask, but the first question that I have is that I found it very helpful the last time when we came together that you were able to provide sort of a sense of the population in York County that is experiencing homelessness. And I know that the number that you have out there is about 431 as of the latest pit count in York County. And the last time we were here, you had broken that down, again, in a rough sense of about 20% of the population at the time that year seemed to really be appropriate for a very intensive supportive housing, kind of housing first situation. And then that the other 80% broke down about halfway between people who had some sort of major life situation or event that was really causing them to become unhoused or have an issue with housing. And that could have been substance use, could be domestic violence, could be some issue that really is the underlying cause or at the root of things. And then there was a population, and this was especially coming out of COVID, the other 40%, there were folks who were they were employed and they had, pretty stable situation, and then their landlord jacked up up their rent $400 a month and they couldn't afford it. And there's just a mismatch between the folks who, what they have to pay rent and what their rent was going to cost. And I'm wondering if this year we can get that same sense, because I think that really enables us to get a handle around the scope and scale of the problem, and is it, you know, is one becoming more of an issue than the other, that sort of thing.
Emily or Megan want to?
Thank you, Representative. Oh, sorry. I would say we would really need to review data to break down the current year's data. It changes so drastically year to year. You heard from Megan that the fastest growing population of folks experiencing homelessness are over the age of 50. I think we're seeing that in the shelter every single day. And at any given day, over 30% in our shelter are over the age of 65. I think it just for us has really varied through the years. There was certainly an economic impact coming out of COVID, where we saw an increase in folks who ended up in the shelter because the price of their apartment, the rent went up, and they were priced out of the market. Certainly, there are still a number of people who need access to substance use disorder services and behavioral health care. But I would really have to dig into our data a little bit more, and I would say it ebbs and flows from week to week. We're certainly seeing a huge increase in people over the age of 65. That's very concerning. These are folks who are not going to go to low barrier shelters, the 4 low barrier shelters that were funded last session. These are folks who are going to more kind of non-designated therapeutic shelters. So we're very concerned about that. We're certainly concerned about families. There is absolutely kind of a pricing out of housing for families in York County right now. But I will certainly dig into our data and circle back to all of the elected officials with that.
I think I also don't have statistics necessarily, but I think it does go back to the point of needing a continuum that's healthy and that's funded and have the resources at various points along that spectrum. And that includes the kind of subspectrum that's within the homeless services area, because as Megan mentioned, I think it does change depending on what's going on in our economy, what's happening, you know, in local markets within York County. So I think we need to make sure that we have, you know, enough resources to be able to respond to the needs of individuals and families for whatever reason that brings them to our door.
I can add a couple of other things to that. I think one is that a lot of that data, so getting good data around those categories requires street outreach. And so last year, a lot of that data came from the Sanford Mental Health Unit acting as street outreach providers, and that was something that was not sustainable. And so we currently only have 2 funded positions in the county to be doing street outreach for the 471 people, which is probably an undercounting, by the way, in the PID count. So that's an important priority for us, is to get more street outreach folks who can engage with folks and do formal assessments. And that's where because everyone's individual circumstances are different, and part of the hub goal is to do assessments of all individuals who are homeless in order to understand their circumstances. So I think we do need more street outreach capacity to get good data and to engage folks. We are in the middle of doing that, and so we can share what data we do have.
And just, I'll speak for myself. I don't know if anyone else has any other question at the moment, but I will say as a legislator, we're looking at a very, very tough budget season that's coming up. And I will say, and I will iterate this, we are data-driven. We are driven by looking at the scope of a problem and looking at the root causes of the problem so that we can put our dollars towards solving the root causes. And the root causes are some of the things that you've touched on, but my concern is that your response to me right now is that we don't have that information. And I would say that should be a priority so that you can help the legislature understand the type of response that's needed. And that'll tie into my second question, which is I sent some questions to Carter before this session, which was to say, I really find it heartening that you have tied the shelter situation to the other housing issues that we face. But when we talk about root cause analysis of the problem, a lot of the problem that we face is because housing is becoming more and more scarce, and therefore the prices that people can charge for housing, whether that's a home for ownership or a home for rent or an apartment, whatever it is, keep going up and up. And we simply, as a state, as a nation, cannot afford to continue to subsidize the solution around and the aftermath of that without addressing creating the housing that we need. And I know many York County communities have been standing up to say, we are going to build and create the kind of housing that we need to support seniors. So we know about the 70 units of senior housing supported by Avesta, created by Avesta and supported by Kennebunk Savings that are going in Kennebunk. Not there yet, so we've got to get there. We know about a lot of the projects that many of the housing authorities are doing to create housing. You didn't mention, Carter, Housing First, which is a program that we funded in the legislature that is starting, applications are starting in January, funding will be in June, to create 12 to 15 supportive housing settings around the state to address the needs of those who are chronically homeless, based on the 3 Housing First properties that exist already in Portland. Hopefully Teresa's place in Bangor is going to open soon. Keep waiting on the date. I guess it's now January, which it would be great if that was happening before the winter sets in, but January is good if that's all we can get. So I guess I just want to push this point a little bit harder, which is I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing and the folks that you're helping. I myself, as a child, experienced homelessness. I understand the trauma that it creates for life. That said, the way to address it in the best way possible is to create permanent homes that people can live in. If all they need is a home, they get a home. If they need a home that has some level of supportive services, those should also be available. And for folks who need a Housing First setting with 24/7 kind of someone on site to just help with whatever comes up, we already funded that, and there are applications I know happening from around York County and around the state to take advantage of that funding. But I want to make sure we focus on what we're doing, and then I would really want to hear here's how we're participating. If we are the shelter. In addition, I was just out at York County last week, a couple days ago, talking about the treatment center and the fact that we do have treatment beds. So how does this all fit in, and how do we think about not just the homeless shelter system, but how does it fit in with the rest of the housing picture? And so that's one issue that I'd really like to hear more about at this point.
Thank you for that, Representative. And I think it goes without saying, the work of the Housing Committee, yourself, your colleagues, it has been really, it will change the landscape of affordable housing and will have an incredible impact. I do think that it's incredibly important to remember that York County shelter programs, as York County's only non-domestic violence shelter, has been in existence for over 45 years, has remained full every year of its existence, and is in drastic need. We are in desperate need of funding, or we will close. Our beds have always been full. It just so happens that the impact of COVID, the financial impact that all of our agencies have experienced in providing shelter, housing, and all of the supportive services to keep people housed, those costs have gone up 30 to 40% with no increase to funding to any of our agencies. So it's unsustainable for us to keep this entry point for an entire continuum of care, the entry point for this whole continuum, open without an increase of funding. And we would be happy to come to the table and talk about all of the ways that emergency shelters are absolutely the right access point for the folks that we serve. We would love for people to avoid shelter. Our best work is done around diversion. A shelter is not a place for a family, but it happens to be the only option for a lot of families to get them safe, to get them secure, to get them inside, and to ensure that they don't die. And so we would be happy to come to the table and talk about all of the ways that the shelter and all of our agencies really help to hold this entire continuum together. Of course, we need to continue focusing on developing affordable housing. It's a crisis in Maine. It's its own crisis. there is also a severe homelessness crisis that if we do not address, we will continue to see an increase in folks in all of our town squares, and an increase in folks who will die tonight, tomorrow, and the next night.
I think Emily, I'm going to apologize because our school district partners will have our heads if we don't move on to their section of the agenda. So, Representative Gear, we look forward to getting you the data that would be helpful during the session. I think, unfortunately, because of time, we will probably need to move on. If there are folks that have other questions, we are all available after the meeting today or at any time to answer those questions. But I think we will need to move along to the second half of the evening with the school district presentation. So, Matt, do you want to help? Well, first, let me say thank you very much to everybody in this room for this portion of the presentation and to our panel. So thank you guys again very much.